I would like to introduce Dr. Noam Zadov. Noam is an assistant professor in Jewish Studies and History at Indiana University, where he was the founding director of Olamot, Center for Scholarly and Cultural Exchange with Israel. In this academic year, in the current year, is in the Israel Institute visiting professor at the University of Munich and a guest professor at the University of Innsbruck. And Zadov published extensively on Gershom Scholem, most recently co-edited a co-edited volume with Miriam Zadov, scholar and a Kabbalist, The Life and Work of Gershom Scholem, which was published in 2018. And of course, you probably know his book, Gershom Scholem, From Berlin to Jerusalem and Back. Someone Had to Return. Which was published in English in Brandeis University Press in 2018 also, which recently won the Azrieli Institute Prize for the best book in Israel Studies.
Okay, thank you for this kind introduction. And fortunately, I didn't plan a PowerPoint to go with this lecture, so I'm free of the travails of technology. So Jerusalem have seen many bright and very distinguished intellectuals over the years. But interestingly enough, only two of them from this vivid world left a library behind, which was preserved as such and become an institution for themselves of almost pilgrimage for scholars that come from all over the world to study them. Well, I managed to count three after really a long time of thinking. I'll start with the less central one, and this is the Library of Meir Bnayahu, who is now next to the old President House in Rechavia. And the two central ones, I don't have to say, Schocken Library and the Scholem Library. It's interesting because, for example, Martin Buber, who was really a central figure, didn't manage to, and had a large book collection, didn't manage to create a library after his death. As we heard yesterday, Schocken's library from Professor Hacke, Schocken saw his library, which I was very glad that he mentioned that, was perceived as part of the national project. He wanted it to be part of the National Library, in a way, a complementing part. Scholem did that practically. So he sold his library, his private library, in the 60s, in 1965, to the National Library for the sum of $45,000 at the time, which is equivalent today to $350,000, which were translated into a monthly payment of today's $700 a month for the rest of his life. So his part of the agreement was that he it ceased to be private. He was obliged to show students or people who wanted to visit the library, show it to them. Well, it's not a coincidence that both of them, Scholem and Schocken, achieved it. I think it was a direct result of commitment of both for the ideal of collecting books and the ideology of cultural Zionism. In the coming minutes, 15-20 minutes, I will discuss the ideology that stood behind Scholem and Schocken's collection work and the relationship to books, libraries, in the light of the commitment to the Jewish National Project. At the end, I will suggest that Scholem's famous letter to Scholem from 1937, which was lying at the exhibition yesterday in Scholem's handwriting, about his true intentions of studying Kabbalah or researching Kabbalah, is also a way to understand not only the physical, not only the worldly attitude towards books and collecting, but also the metaphysical, hidden aspect of book collection. So we heard a lot about Schocken's collection yesterday. I will start with Scholem. In 1924, Scholem writes a letter to Martin Buber, as early as 1924, with a plan, an idea, to create out of the libraries of central scholars in the field of Kabbalah a library, posthum library, that will be created after the deaths of the scholars. Hugo Bergmann, the director of the National Library, stood behind that, according to Scholem, and supported enthusiastically this idea. Scholem mentioned, beside him and Buber, that after their death, the collection of Shmuel Abba Horodetsky and Shimon Dubnov would be that. Buber's response was very positive. He even said he already talked with Horodetsky about that. And he also suggested to add Agnon to the list. But at the same time, Buber was a bit reluctant, since he said, and I quote, "Gut wär's," wrote Buber to Scholem, "wenn Agnon mittäte, der ein paar hübsche Stücke hat. Aber wird misslaunig, wenn man von Tode redet." So he was not excited about making plans at what happens after his death. But what is common to those wishes to collect books and put them together in one place? And what I will argue, or according to my understanding of Scholem and Schocken, we have to go back and to look at the Kinus project, at the Kinus idea, at the idea of gathering, which stood at the core of cultural Zionism. The first person who came up with the idea of gathering was Achad Ha'am, with his book Otzar HaYahadut. The idea was, out of the understanding that this hour in history is an important hour, it's an hour of change, it's a point of transition for the Jewish people, there is a place for a canonization. Just like Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi canonized the Mishnah after the temple, the destruction of the temple, just as Yosef Karo wrote his Shulchan Aruch after the expulsion of Spain. Now in the Zionist era, we also need such a book. And in the spirit of European nationalism, Achad Ha'am thought about an encyclopedia, which will have all what you need to know about Jewish culture. Bialik, who actually developed this idea, broadened it to all sorts, not just encyclopedia entries, but whole libraries. And this is what Bialik wrote about the Kinus. Every act of sealing proclaimed the closure of an old period. Bialik called it sealing, gniza, chatima. And at the same time, heralds the beginning of a new era. And none other than the excellent essence of the old, after it has successfully passed through the new atmosphere and emerged from its purified, itself becomes the soil for new plants, offering them moisture and succulence that assist their growth and flourishing. That is, what we need now is to seal a canon of Jewish culture in which we decide what should be forgotten and what should be taken towards the future. Scholem was enthusiastic about the idea, and it influenced him a lot. In his letter to Bialik in 1925, in which he describes his plan towards Kabbalah, he writes, "It's absolutely impossible about his intentions, what he's intending to do in the coming 50 years. It is absolutely impossible to attain knowledge of the creation and developments of the Kabbalah as long as 70% of all important texts are still in manuscript, scattered throughout the diaspora. I am positive that there is no hope for restoring and researching the Kabbalah if these manuscripts are not studied. The most important of them, and there are many, must be published in critical, analytical editions to refine and clarify the truth from them about the development of antiquity and Kabbalah." So Kinus for Scholem, this idea of ingathering, was an academic project. Unlike Bialik, who was thinking about the popular editions in translation, for example, Sefer HaAgada of Bialik is a great example for that, where everything is translated and being presented to the wide public. Scholem was an elitist. He was not a popular. He said if someone can't really read the Aramaic of the Zohar, he shouldn't start even reading the Zohar. This is essentials. This, of course, who cannot do that, no? And basically, unlike Bialik, who was a defender of the Hebrew language, for Scholem, the Hebrew language was not that important. And he worked and contributed in the field of Kinus, Zionist cultural work in the German language, as we'll see in connection with Schocken. Schocken was also very committed from the beginning to the idea of ingathering and Kinus. As early as 1916, he talked in a conference at Hotel Savoy before front of Zionist delegates, and he said the following, and I read in German, please forgive me. In den 30.000 Bändern der hebräischen Literatur ruhen unsere Schätzen vergraben und unsere Arbeiten können wahrhafte Mekizei Nirdamim, Erwecker des Schlummernden, sein. Wenn sie die Goldadern wertvollen jüdischen Lebens aus den verschüttelten Büchern herausholen. Unsere Wissenschaft wird lebende Wissenschaft sein können. In unser Zukunftsideal haben wir das Organ, die Tatsache der Vergangenheit und die Gegenwart nach einem Prinzip der Auswahl zu sehen, das die bedeutsamen Vorgänge, die leitenden Kulturwelten heraushebt. Practically a classic way of Kinus, a classic understanding of collecting the materials, the relevant materials from the past, and letting the irrelevant to sink into oblivion. But Schocken's Kinus was more popular than Scholem's, as he declared in the same speech. Unsere Arbeit, I quote, wird erst dann ihre Wirkung beginnen, wenn wir eine gute Darstellung von der Vergangenheit unseres Volkes und seines gegenwärtigen Bestandes unter dem Gesichtspunkt unserer Zukunftsentwicklung in der Hand jedes jüdischen Lesers geben können. The collaboration between Schocken and Scholem actually started many years later, only in 1931 with the establishment of the Schocken Verlag. At that moment, Schocken was very active already with several projects. We heard about most of them, such as the establishment of das Forschungsinstitut für Hebräische Dichtung and the production of the Buber Rosenzweig translation of the Bible. What is interesting about Schocken Verlag is that it was really published at the moment where almost at the evening of the beginning of the persecution of German Jewry. And it became a very paradoxical phenomenon. The moment where German Jewry actually blossomed culturally at its most, thanks to Schocken in many ways, was also in the moment of the destruction. The persecution and the segregation in a paradoxical way created a separate, almost an autonomous cultural space in which Scholem very much acted. But if we look at the projects of the Schocken Verlag, we could see that almost all of them could be very well placed as part of the Kinus project. For example, publishing text originals. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the Schocken Bücherei. Although the Forschungsinstitut für Hebräische Dichtung, of course, could be part of it, but the Schocken Bücherei was actually a collection of sources that are relevant to the present situation. Not only Zionism, but also, as we heard, to encourage, to lift up the spirit of persecuted German Jewry. But also, the Schocken Almanach was intended to bring texts and to bring sources and articles that are relevant in an anarchistic way almost, are relevant to the situation. Scholem played a central role in Schocken's project through publishing volumes with scientific editions. For example, the Zohar, his book, The Geheimnisse der Schöpfung, that Schocken liked so much that he ordered a second bibliophile edition only for him, and the Hebrew book, which was a rare thing to publish a Hebrew book in Germany as part of the Schocken Verlag, Chalomotav shel Shabtai, Rabbi Ashkenazi, which Scholem insisted on it being published in German, since he couldn't he pointed out the complexity of a professor at the Hebrew University publishing in German in the 1930s in Germany. So practically, he forced or persuaded Schocken to have a Hebrew Zatz in a complicated moment. After Schocken's immigration to Palestine, the relationship between the two grew closer. I have a proof of the relationship actually from the words of his student Yosef Weiss, who planned to write a biography on Sholem, which was consisted of anecdotes imitating the Sifrut HaShvachim, the praise literature, the hagiographic Hasidic literature. So I have to read it in Hebrew, otherwise it wouldn't be hagiographic Hasidic literature. And he wrote about Schocken and Sholem. Ana ve'amar, Sholem. מדברים עליו על שוקן הרבה, ואין זו אלא לזות שפתיים ושקר. ואחרי כמה שנים שמעתי מפי זוגתו, פניה, מזוגתו של שולם, שהוא אוהב את שוקן, ואמרה בזה הלשון, לא שהוא בידידות איתו, אלא שהוא אוהב אותו ממש. So, Schocken actually supported Sholem maybe than anyone else in the time, in his flourishing time in Palestine and then in Israel, through the Center of Kabbalah Research, through inviting him at 1938 to America to lecture the lectures that afterwards in 1941 became major trend in Jewish mysticism, that if you really insist or if you're really a fan of the Kinus project, you could also see this as part of Kinus, major trends in Jewish mysticism. And this relationship remained until the death of Schocken in 1959. Now, since time is short, I will come to the letter. And then, while writing or while thinking about this lecture, I thought, why should Sholem write such letter to Schocken as a present from anyone else? Not as a aphorism for himself, but addressed to Schocken as a thank you. And I think that this was at the center of that was actually the idea or a problem that preoccupied both. What is the meaning of collecting book? It has to have a metaphysical side. Beside the national aspect and beside the greed of possessing more and more from something. And this is what he wrote in his letter. This is I think, the central part of this letter. The mountain itself, the things themselves, does not need a key at all. It is only the misty wall of history that surrounds it that must be penetrated. To penetrate it, that is the task that I have set to myself. Would I remain stuck in the mist, suffering from a professorial death taught in the professor, so to speak? Yet, even if it demands sacrifices, the compelling need for a critique of history and for historical criticism cannot be provided in any other way. Now the time is short and I cannot explain what meant for Sholem the word Torah or Torah Tmima, but Torah is also books. Torah is also teachings. It's a library. And I would argue that for Sholem and maybe also for Schocken, the library was a Torah. It has presence of a shrine, of a holy thing that you have to penetrate and through scholarship try to interpret and try to make it accessible or try to understand it. A task which is not easy, and you never know, as your collection will never be full, you'll never know if you ever manage to actually break the code of a library and understand its context. For Schocken, until the end of his life, the spiritual quest was also a central one. And in his last years, he actually delved again into the writing of Rabbi Nachman of Breslev, which first brought him into Judaism. He was used to read them together with Yosef Weiss, Sholem's student, who became also a favorite of Schocken. So, what are the things themselves? What is this library? I guess it's a mystery in a way. We'll never understand it. But what is clear, it's that this point, or being stuck on the way to deciphering the things you're collected in any way, was a point that brought them both together. Walter Benjamin, who always had interesting things to say that fit very much to Scholem and Schocken, since he was part of the Tides, he talked about his library, and maybe this is a quote I should end with. The most profound enchantment for the collector is the locking of individual items with a magic circle, in which they are fixed as a final thrill. The thrill of acquisition passes over them. Everything remembered and thought, everything conscious, become the pedestal, the frame, the base, the lock of his property. The period, the region, the craftsmanship, the former ownership. For a true collector, the whole background of the item add up to a magic encyclopedia whose quintessence is the fate of its object. And if this is not Kabbalah, I don't know what is. Thank you very much.